Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. It is 6 o'clock. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the second class in the Backyard Prairie Series. This is Backyard Prairie Spring. The Backyard Prairie Series is a four-part series that covers what you can do to meet your prairie goals during each season. The next class in the series will be on July 21st. That's Backyard Prairie Summer. Registration is currently open. I'm Amy Keir. I'm the Natural Resources Agent for Johnson County K-State Extension. And before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. This presentation will be recorded, so please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted for the entirety of the presentation. If you have a question during the talk, feel free to add it to the Q&A box. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. She'll have plenty of time to answer all your questions. A link of the recording will be sent to everyone who registered after the presentation has concluded. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter for this evening. Once again, we have Patti Ragsdale. Patti is founder and executive director for Botanical Belonging at Happy Apples Farm. She is the current president of the Kansas Native Plant Society and 2025 recipient of the Stephen L. Tim Award for Excellence in Botany. In 2017, she began volunteering with K-State Extension Master Naturalists in Johnson County and is now an emeritus member. She has been growing and selling native plants in our community since 2016. It was while studying wildlife management at MU that she fell in love with plant taxonomy and the identification of native plants in the field. She formed the nonprofit Botanical Belonging in 2021 to provide native plant education and access to a wide variety of native plant species. Her work focuses on helping people learn about native plants through hands-on interaction in gardens, in propagation, and in natural spaces. So with that, I say welcome, everyone, and I turn it over to Patti. I'm going to stop sharing, let Patti get hers going.
Okay.
There we go. I should not be sharing anymore, correct?
Okay. Yeah, I think you're not.
Okay.
Hello, welcome everybody. Give me just a minute to get my presentation going. I think I don't have it playing yet, so you may get a glimpse of my notes, so forgive me for that. I think okay. I think that's right. Now,
Oh, we see
yeah.
the notes.
See, you see my notes. Now I got to
Yes.
figure out how to play from here. Here we go. All right. Continue to share. Continue to share this keynote window. Continue to share. I think that's right. But what
Yep.
I'm not seeing, am I showing? Am I sharing?
You are sharing, and we don't see any notes. We just see slides.
Except I'm supposed to see my notes. So that is the thing that I'm
Okay.
kind of trying to. Uh,
Patty, it says winter series.
oh, I forgot to change that. I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
All right.
So
Way to
you
call
all
her
are,
out, Julie.
I'm so sorry. You guys, it is
Me
spring.
of
I'm
all
sorry.
people, right?
We are talking about spring today, not winter. I do have the
Okay.
right presentation. Um, so let me, aha, got it, got it. Now I have my notes. All right. Okay, thank you everyone for your patience with me as I got this put together, and I apologize for the incorrect date and the incorrect season. I am just, as everyone else, very busy in my gardens this spring, and you will see from the number of slides in this presentation that there is a lot to talk about right now. Um, as Amy said, I am the founder of Botanical Belonging. My name is Patti Ragsdale, and we're going to talk about spring and how we work in these gardens that are primarily, and in my case, almost entirely composed of native plants. And I'm going to cover a few different things. So, thank you, Johnson County Extension, for inviting me. I love working with you all, and it's super fun to have so many people excited about working with native plants in our community. Okay, so uh, this is where I usually work with people and native plants is in my gardens. This is my front yard. I showed this same one slide last time because I just love the kids all gathered around looking at all the pretty flowers and learning just about native plants in gardens. And then the parents, in this case, are there really to start to think about how they engage kids in gardens and sometimes themselves get used to not being afraid of native bees or that because it's a native plant that it's that might be dangerous. Uh, so this is what I usually do, but we are online tonight, and so I'm going to be trying to show you some real life, like some of them just taken today, pictures of what it's like to work in these gardens in spring. And I've got a couple of different ways that we can look at these things. So it's been about 30 years of working in gardens that it's taken me to really develop a comfortable style for me to keep up with fairly extensive gardens around Botanical Belonging and my home here out in Tonganoxie, Kansas. Okay, so let's move to what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to this is just an overview. We're going to talk about both new spaces and established spaces. And if you, as you can see from this image here, this is more what my garden looks like right now. Not as exciting and vibrant and green as you saw in the previous picture, but there are really beautiful small things that you can find in these gardens right now. And pictured in the inset there is bloodroot. That is one that I just have tucked away by a wall because I'm hoping to establish a larger community of that. But that's a fairly conservative species that we find in woodlands around here. So having some spring ephemeral flowers like that that come up really early is helpful in these native gardens. In the background, you can see there's a kind of a light blue thing blooming. That's called sand phlox. So trying to find just a few things that will come up really early and bloom can help you kind of get through this early period in the gardens where they're pretty much still looking wintry. Um, so we're going to talk about new spaces and we're going to talk about how in these new spaces, last time we talked about actually doing site prep and we'll review that today, but evaluating how that site prep, the prep work that we did for these new spaces, how it kind of fared through the winter. And then we'll kind of very briefly touch on planting because honestly, if we're planting plugs, it's just like planting any other plant. Um, and we'll evaluate seedlings for seeded areas and also in these more established spaces, and then kind of how we do mowing and weed control in new spaces. Established spaces, we're going to really talk a lot about the ways that the things that I use, kind of tricks that I use to keep things looking a tiny bit more structured in some of these gardens. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm going to go over tonight, and I'm going to try to talk fast because I know, run out of time. But I do want there to be time for questions. And I just made that overlap. Okay. I'm trying to see the time so I can keep track of myself. Okay. New spaces. This is what a space looked like last year. Probably in the summer, we did this, prepping it for planting in the fall. So usually you're going to need to give yourself at least a month of time for these things to settle in before you can plant, depending on how you prep them. But this is one space that we'll go back to here in a minute. So new spaces are prepped. Here's just a review of how we prep. And this is for not seeded spaces. This is for if I was going to create more of a structured garden with transplants. This springtime is better for transplants than seeds. So if you haven't done a seeded area or seeded an area over the winter, you're probably looking at this kind of garden starting. You can use some seeds, but a lot of them need some winter cold before well, a lot of them need that to break dormancy, but not necessarily always. So you might get some germination. The reality is, in truth, it's probably not the best time to think about doing a seeded garden, like throwing seeds out right now, unless you're just seeding regular old cool season lawn grass. Um, so for this garden or for this presentation, this is a lot of the site prep that we'll talk about. Just doing the typical cardboard and mulch is what this is representing. Um, we try to make the soil as bare as we can underneath, and I do that by scalping often with a mower, just get it as close as I can to the ground, or maybe some other implement just to get as much of the grass and things out of there. And then I put down cardboard and in my best do my best attempt to wet that down really, really well after I've put the mulch on top. And I used rocks on the edges, things like that, to weight that on the edges and to hold the mulch on top of my cardboard. I will also show you a trench, that the way I make a trench to hold mulch and the edges of cardboard. So this is a really important tool for a lot of the maintenance in these gardens, especially this time of year. Okay, so that's a little review. And if you have questions or more in-depth questions, I am going to try to breeze through all this so that we have time at the end and we can cover that in a little more detail. Okay, so say that you prepped a site for seeding. Well, say you might have burned it, or maybe you killed the grass off some other way with a tarp or a chemical, or even you could even do it with that cardboard and mulch, and maybe do layers of topsoil on top of it. So lots of different ways to do that, but basically you're wanting to have bare soil. So at this point, a seeded area might look a little bit like this photo. Lots of bare ground still there and just some little tiny plants. Who knows what they are? Seedling ID is super tricky, even for somebody like me. I know seedlings pretty well just because we grow from seeds here. And so I've seen, maybe 300 different species come out of their seeds and develop their first leaves. But they look different at that point a lot of times than they do when they grow up. So just knowing what plant you planted does not necessarily mean you will know what it looks like when it comes out of the ground. So seedling ID takes a lot of time, but don't stress about it because that is not a realistic goal, really, when you've seeded an area to be able to identify your seedlings that are coming up. It's fun. And I've walked in my first seeded areas, which we'll see, were in 2014, and they look way different now than they did. But we'll talk a little bit about that. But I used to walk that constantly, just trying to figure out what was coming up. It is very, very hard. But the biggest task that you will have in these seated areas in the spring is making yourself mow. Sounds counterintuitive, but you're going to want to set your mower as high as you can and mow this off once or twice early in the season. When stuff starts to elongate and come up, you want to mow it before you will have so much thatch come out of that that it smothers too many things. So, maybe when it gets, depends on your mower. Now I have a tractor, so I can mow pretty high. I can hold my brush hog way up and just mow off the top. And there's another tool that I'll show you later that might help you if things get a little bit too tall. But just if you make yourself do it, that will be a really, really helpful thing for your plants because those little seedlings are easily shaded out by some of the more aggressive weeds. So, obvious things that get really big and tall would be um, giant ragweed, which is a native plant, but not one that you want to have get a hold in your garden because it will take a while to get rid of, even though it's an annual. Um, so common ragweed, giant ragweed, those two kind of things, they're gonna happen, and it's not gonna be a big deal. You just, if you mow it and keep it from going to seed, you will save yourself years and years of trying to eradicate that, so that that patch where that has shaded it out can start to grow the plants that you really want. So mowing, in spite of how counterintuitive that is, will really help you. And yes, you may mow off a few flowers, and that will make you super sad. So getting past that and knowing, just mow it before that happens, and it might help you get that done. So mow it so that your seedlings have the sun, have some space, have some nutrients, and you knock back some of those weeds that are going to cause you problems later and keep your seedlings from growing, and remove the weeds that you do see come up. Like if you happen to notice or be able to identify the giant ragweed, just Google it, giant ragweed, and you'll see what it looks like. Um, if you see that come up, just pull it. It's an annual, it's fine. Some other things that there are noxious weeds that will be very hard for you to identify at this point. I'm thinking Johnson grass kind of things. Bindweed, if you happen to live in a rural area like I am, that is going to be always a problem. But just give yourself some grace there, and just do your mowing, and you'll have yourself about 3 years before you really get super happy with it. But you won't only have to mow those first year or two in these seeded areas. Anyway, seeding is a little bit of a long game, but can really cover a lot of ground for very little money. Okay, mulched spaces. A lot about mulch spaces and evaluating that is just making sure that that cardboard and mulch did its job and gives you, because that will give you a couple of years of weed suppression without much help moving forward. So in this case, I created this space last summer sometime, and this is what it looked like. No, I didn't get good weed suppression because I didn't water that cardboard. So all of the bindweed, which does survive this kind of weed suppression, came up from between those the overlapping cardboard that you saw there, and it was thick. So bindweed can be a super big problem for areas like mine out in the rural areas, but a lot of in the city, you might not have so much of it. In this case, the control that I probably won't pull this, and I rarely do this, but I may spray this with Remedy. It's a product that I use in the pastures or the prairies here. I spot spray Sericea lespedeza with it, and I have seen it work on bindweed pretty well. So I will probably use that because that is the majority of the weed that is here. If I tried to pull this, I would be pulling up my cardboard too. It has pretty strong rhizomatous roots that go everywhere. So that will be my fix for that area, and I will probably let that sit until late in the spring, maybe May, see how it looks in May. It definitely needs a lot more water to break down the cardboard. But our other space on the right here that I showed you before actually had a really, really successful weed suppression. And I didn't put a lot of seedlings in there. I went ahead and did this last fall. I put some seedlings in. And so we're going to look at this a little more closely to see how some of those survived. But I put just a few in, and you can barely see them, which is the reality actually. When you plant in the fall, you're just hoping that they survive the winter, and then really you get kind of a second year look to these plants. It's pretty awesome to plant in the fall. Okay, so um, let's see. Did I cover everything? I think I did. So if you have questions about that and different ways to fix, we can talk again about that later. Okay, so in that mulch space, I got close. The one that was a successful weed suppression or site prep. And you can see that one of my plants, and this one happened to be a transplant from the garden, and it came with some really nice stems, which are helpful for finding your seedlings in the spring. Making sure that you leave a stem is kind of like having a built-in plant tag, right? It tells you what was there. So in this case, this was Monarda bradburyana, and I'm trying to make a little display of that down here so people can see it in a garden because it blooms early, like May 1st. This will start blooming. Really beautiful thing. So you're going to check for seedling survival. And you're going to look for your plant tags. And in this case, I put in a spotted bee balm that is Monarda punctata. And it's a really short-lived perennial or sometimes sold as an annual. But pardon me, I may cough a little bit when I talk. But spotted bee balm or Monarda punctata is really cool. So I just got a little seedling out of our plant supply here and replaced that one. So planting in these areas that have been prepped really well and the cardboard is gone, the it keeps the soil moist underneath. So it was super easy just to, find a new spot and plant that plant. I usually will not plant in the same spot just because I'm never really sure if that plant died or not. Um, but I want to show you though that I even keep plant tags in my gardens, in these new gardens, because it is almost the only way you can tell whether your plant has died or not. I would make sure when you're planting these new gardens to just plan to get yourself a good way to mark your plants. That's not going to be forever. You're really going to be able to use those stems to identify. And after a while working in these gardens, you remember what you did. You remember where your plants are, and you will learn to identify them just like I do mine. Anyway, planting is super simple. It's just like planting any other plant. You dig the hole, you put the plant in, and just try to make sure that the soil levels stay approximately the same. It's good not to put mulch right on top of these plants this time of year, especially. Just give them just a tiny bit of space, and they will start thriving almost immediately if all your prep is done really well. But you can see in this space there really aren't any other things growing, and that's really what we want to see. We only want to see the little baby plants that we're putting in there. Okay, so in more like mature gardens, but I'm just showing you here that controlling weeds, if you should have planted something maybe last fall and you come out here in spring looking for it and it looks like this, you've got some weeding to do. Making sure you're giving your seedlings in these spaces some space to grow is really important in these early years, um, mostly this first year. So just make sure that you can see the plant tag is still there and you learn to identify this happens to be swamp milkweed or Asclepias incarnata. So just plan to do some weeding. It's really easy right now because the ground is soft. Let's see. Oh, there it is. I circled it for you so you could see it. That's the milkweed that we put in this garden. The rest of it, I need to take out. All right. So I'm going to show you, this is what my garden looks like in the summer, maybe early summer. And we're going to work in some of these spaces tonight. So when we when we're talking about mature spaces, they you saw the same view earlier. The first slide kind of showed the front of my house with the garden in spring. I mean, it looks really different, doesn't it? Not very much going on. So knowing that you've done the prep work in the spring in this garden to keep some sense of order in here. Is still, it's a fairly rambunctious garden, right? But it actually has some structure in it where you can see here's a clump here, here's a clump here. They all kind of run together, and there's almost no space in between them. But there's a few really important things that you can do to keep that happening. And if you do them right now, it's really, really easy. So the first thing, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, is, oops, sorry, we're going to talk about seated spaces too. Um, in fact, we're going to talk about seated spaces first. I forgot. I reordered my slides. That's why I haven't. I'm just getting ready. It's all so fresh. Okay. This is the seated space in front of my house, like across my yard. At my mowed yard, I have a prairie out there, and I think I started this in 2017, so it's about 9 years old. And these are a bunch of gray-headed coneflower, Retibita pinnata. It's awesome for giving you a huge display of flowers in the summer. So we're going to talk about what to do in a mature space like this too. All right. So in that space, the biggest thing that we want to work on this time of year is mowing again. Um, making sure that there aren't any trees. So that space that I showed you in the photo before, I do burn that one. So that's easy. I can just burn that, and if there are any trees standing up, I cut those and treat those so that I can keep that really clean. Um, this other space that's in this photo is right in front of the south side of the house, and it was seeded. This is actually a picture from 2017. I seeded this in 2014. Looks entirely different now in the summer, totally different mix of plants. These are kind of early successional plants that are really good in those seeded areas for getting a lot of color early in the planting. That's mostly lance leaf coreopsis. There's also gray-headed coneflower in there and some Canada wild rye that is good for these new plantings to get a cooler season grass that comes up fast. So, but what you're seeing here is mostly the lance leaf coreopsis and a lot of purple prairie clover. Those come up really fast in these open spaces. So this was seeded onto gravelly construction soil. And so here, what, 11 years later, after 12 years, 14, yeah, 12 years later, I am mowing this. So in this case, I mowed it fairly recently, pretty high, because I can't burn it. So I have to do something at least every 2 years to this garden. And still, I've got to really, really look for trees. And there are a lot more trees in this. The longer this garden grows, the more I see trees. So that is probably the biggest challenge that you're going to have in these seeded areas is identifying and removing trees in these gardens. But mowing does help. And I go through before I mow in usually sometime in the winter, I'll go through and try to identify all of the trees that I see in there and I cut them and treat them, and then I can mow pretty easily. So late winter, you can cut it really low if you want to. But if you're mowing right now in the spring, you need to mow it pretty high. And I've said right here that there are two really good tools for smaller areas. If you don't have something that can mow really high, you might use a hedge trimmer. It's a little hard on your back, but you can kind of get that kind of mowed off like you need to and move some of the thatch out of it. A brush cutter tool does that too, makes it kind of harder to spread or remove the thatch because it's going to throw stuff everywhere, but it might save your back a little bit of trouble. These are those two tools. So these are my three best tools for maintaining these areas. That brush cutter tool is also helpful. Say later in the season, you do find that you have a bunch of giant ragweed in there. I can go in there and cut it down several times in the season if I want to, just to keep it from going to seed because it's an annual. So being able to use a tool like the brush cutter, that's the one on the right, is really, really helpful. So that's one of my absolute favorite management tools. And then the hedge trimmer is the tool on the left that I use all the time. And then, of course, my trusty mower. All right. So for both of those spaces, both the mulch spaces and the um, seeded spaces, edges can be super, super helpful. And like I said, the ground is super soft right now, and trying to define that edge is best done right now if you can. I have too many edges, so sometimes it takes me 2 years to get around the whole garden. But and in this case, you can see it took me on the right here or on the left. You can see a picture that the grass has encroached from my yard into my garden, and I've totally lost that edge. So I'm going to show you how I got to what I have on the right there, where you can barely, I mean, it was an afternoon photo. This was just a couple days ago, where you can cut this trench and fill that with mulch, and that really sets things off. So this edge, really had disappeared. Here's that photo again. And then I went with my shovel and reestablished the um, one edge of it on the outside. So I cut all that grass. I just take my sharpshooter shovel. I call it a sharpshooter, but it's also called a trench shovel, I think. Really, really useful tool. Um, and I cut one edge all the way along where my edge used to be, and then I go on the inside and do the same thing. And then I have this kind of big lump of soil that I take out. I take out the soil, I take out everything and remove that. And then what I actually did after that, and you can see how nice that trench looks, is I took that sharpshooter and I undercut those strawberries. They don't really care. They're amazingly good at growing. And it's kind of wet now, so they don't really dry out. So I undercut. This is wild strawberry, by the way. It's a prairie strawberry that is not the false strawberry you see in your backyard. It's totally different. Um, but this one grows in our prairies, and when I take it out of the prairie and put it in a garden like this, it covers pretty solid, and will compete pretty well with that grass because that's what it's used to doing. But in this case, I undercut it with a shovel so I could take out that rhizomatous grass, which is probably something like quackgrass or brome, that really spreads aggressively and a long way with long rhizomes. So I just pulled it all out, and my strawberries were still there, as you can see. And then I filled that trench with mulch, and all of a sudden, this has become two separate spaces, the lawn over here and the garden over here. It really is an inexpensive and fairly easy way, fairly easy. Now, it is work, but a fairly easy way to define these spaces a little bit better. Okay, and also reestablishing edges is about making sure your paths, your openings for people are still there. And you can see here, this garden had not gotten very much care in a couple of years, and I have almost obliterated the pathway with weeds. So we cut that all down and used cardboard and mulch again to kind of define that rock. And you can just use cardboard and mulch to make these paths too. And it's super, super effective, just to clean something up really fast and kind of redefine that space as garden and people space. So giving yourself some space really kind of makes it talk to us as a garden. Here's another kind of take on that whole edge thing, is kind of maintaining designs in the garden. And in this case, this is palm sedge that we hadn't cut it back. Usually I would cut back all my sedges pretty early. I might be out there in January and February on nice days trying to cut some of the dead leaves off. But in this case, I hadn't, and it was smashing a little Monarda, that Monarda Bradburyana we talked about before. Um, and it was also kind of hiding the rocks. So this was right after I did it that I took the picture on the right. And this will wash off, and those rocks will look a lot brighter and whiter once some of the old material gets washed off of it. But you can see that all that took was removing the leaves that were covering that. And then I cut back the dead stems of the palm sedge so that the Monarda, and I moved some leaves away from the Monarda so it could have a little bit more air, a little bit more light, and that Monarda will pop back up and be blooming by the 1st of May. So this space, and I cut down my stems that were up there by that flower, that strawberry pot. So, just cleaning spaces up and just showing where the edges used to be is a really, really good way. And just on the edges, not really getting back in a garden and doing that, just those edges can really help make these gardens, keep these gardens looking a little more tidy for you and the people that you invite to see them without really taking anything away from the habitat that you're providing back in the garden. So this is kind of hard to see because again, it was in the afternoon, but this is an area where I'm going to use that same kind of trench technique to redefine a space between plants. Some of the plants that I like best are spreaders because they'll fill a space for me pretty solidly without having to buy, 10 of it. I'm going to buy two or three, and they're going to spread and fill a pretty big space and make a big show. And in this case, this is Helianthus occidentalis. It's called Western sunflower or few leaf sunflower. They have it at the Pollinator Prairie. Very pretty, kind of a nice diminutive sunflower, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it is encroaching, and I don't know if you can really see it here. If you can see my cursor, it's coming into these prairie dropseed. There's an arc of prairie dropseed here, and that's supposed to be a design element, and the sunflower is supposed to stay behind it. So I needed to make that happen again, and this is how I do it. I go behind the prairie drop seed with my trusty little shovel and I cut that line. And then because these are a rhizomatous species and fairly easy to remove, they're not really deep or anything. I can just scrape it off between the prairie drop seed and pull it out so that it really knocks them back. To that space that I want to keep them in. They're going to creep back out, but the more often I do that, the easier this task is. It really isn't hard at all. This probably took me maybe 15 minutes, except I had to stop and take pictures so I could show you, which I don't mind doing at all. And you can see here on the left how easy, I mean, I'm just pulling that, just picking it right out of the ground, and the rhizome is coming with it. That's my little Western sunflower. And on the right, I wanted to show you how pretty they actually are in this setting when they're blooming. They are just an airy kind of spray of these beautiful tiny sunflowers. So for a garden, this sunflower is really, really good. A lot of them are just too aggressive. But this one is a pretty nice one. Um, Spreading plants like that are, they sound scary and they can be, and you do need to get to know them a little bit sometimes, but they can really help kind of further that idea of large expanses of one species without having to buy a ton of plants. So that is an important concept. And here I'm showing it again with a much more aggressive species. This one is cutleaf coneflower, goes by Sochan, or its Latin name is Rebecca laciniata. Really pretty, but it does spread pretty aggressively underground. And it gets really tall, not like our nice little Western sunflower. This one is a big, tall, black-eyed Susan relative. And so I did the same thing. I made that trench. I took out all of those rhizomes and actually potted them up so people can buy them and take them home because it really is a beautiful plant. And separating it here from fox sedge, doing that too, having some textures that are pretty opposite, like a grassy texture next to a leafy texture like this one. That's a really pretty design element and being able, and it helps you as a garden manager, a gardener, to keep that to see what's happening in that garden. So this was again a fairly simple thing to accomplish. Doesn't take very much time, and then I just mulch that area in between, and that keeps that soil nice and moist and pliable, so that when I have to do this again, it's a lot easier. Okay, and one of the other things that I'd like to mention is the shrubs. So when a lot of times my shrubs are in the garden, which is a different kind of way to think about it. But I learned this with elderberry, which is the Sambucus canadensis that you see here. Um, a lot of these shrubs are really clonal. They like to spread underground, so they sucker really bad. And the elderberry in particular will the stems, it's kind of just semi-woody. Those stems don't live very long, maybe just a few years, and they're depending on another stem to come up. And so I need to give it a little bit of space, so I always have elderberries, younger stems of elderberry. And then the older ones just die off and stay in there. So mulching it around the bottom does a couple things for me. It tells me, where I want to keep it. I want it to move around in this space, and I can mow pretty easily around it to cut down all the suckers that are actually spreading out into the yard and into the neighbor's yard, by the way. So, and it keeps it clean. It also suppresses the weeds that grow in the middle. So that's why I included the photo there on the far right is if I don't do that, there is giant ragweed. There's every other thing that I can think of that grows in there. I am constantly throwing a lot of uh, things that I know will seed into that space to try to have something compete. But I keep that space like that so that I can show people what happens to these patches of elderberry when you're kind of hoping for a tree shape when you're getting something more like this. The another one that I'm showing here is American hazelnut or American filbert. That is Corylus americana, and it is gorgeous. It's super fun to have around. I love it. But it also spreads, but not as aggressively or as strangely as the elderberry does. So the hazelnut is really, really beautiful, worth having, and it does produce little filberts for you if you like those. Um, and in this case, it's at the end of I have some that are out in the yard, and they actually look better than this one, but this one is on the edge of a wet area. They do like a little bit more moisture. But putting that mulch around there really kind of helps set it off from the rest of the yard and keeps suppressing the yard from coming in. For ones that are in my garden spaces, that's a little more. I have one nanny berry, it's a viburnum, and viburnums do sucker too. Uh, because they're in a garden space that's already mulched and it is suckering into other plants, those are just me getting in there with my clippers and identifying those woody stems that are coming up and clipping it to keep it where I want it. So hopefully that makes sense there, but that's a really kind of important thing to do, especially if you're liking to do elderberry, to try to make sure that you're mulching those areas underneath so that you can kind of keep those shrubs less weedy, less open for weeds to come in. Um, Being able to identify seedlings, I talked about this earlier, is it can be really important to in maintaining designs. Uh, Most cases, you're really just going to pull things that are not your plant that you wanted. One of the first things people usually ask is, how do I know which one's my plant? And it's hard. It really is. It's hard to do. Um, And that's why I really encourage people to plant your own plants. Don't have somebody plant them for you. Just plant them yourself. think about the design, make sure you know where things went and use plant tags until you kind of feel comfortable and leave your stems. So, in this case, I know, what I'm looking at, and the two plants on the left are Retivita pinnata and Silphium. This is Silphium terebinthinaceum, but it was too big to put on there. So that's prairie dock. If you've ever, and it's not a dock, it's a Silphium, but it's awesome in a garden. It's absolutely beautiful. I love it. But all the Silphiums will seed themselves pretty aggressively. And when I sell people one, I try to always send them with a caution to not let those go to seed if you can help it. The birds love the seeds, and that's amazing, but they are messy eaters and they drop them everywhere. And this little plant right here, if I don't get it out, the whole taproot that comes down from that, it's like a dandelion. If I just take the top off, it pops right back up better than it was before. So you need to just get them out because those are like 9 feet tall or something when they get their flower stalks, which are pretty, very pretty, very striking plant, great one for the garden. So I don't want you to think that these are not plants you want to have. You do. You just have to be able to identify those seedlings when they are falling in your garden before they become a problem. If you miss some, you miss some, you just cut it off and keep cutting it off. It will take a few years, but it will eventually die. Um, on the far left there, that's Retivita pinnata. That's that gorgeous plant that you saw in the seated area in front of my house. Lots and lots of yellow flowers. It's awesome. But it just happens to have fallen in a place where I don't want those. And it's a tall plant. So when you start to recognize when plants are coming up where you don't want them, um, you have choices. You can either compost them, or you can share them with neighbors, or you can move them, transplant them yourself, and create bigger gardens, new gardens out of the abundance that you're going to have in your own garden. On the far right is some of our winter annual weeds. They're not native plants, but they're very, very common and they're pretty. These are henbit and dead nettle. There's Veronica. There's a lot of very early winter annual weeds that provide a lot of pollinator benefit. But if you leave them in your garden, they will totally obliterate your design. It'll be gorgeous, henbit and dead nettle, um, but you won't be able to see your own tiny little spring flowers that you've planted. So I just encourage people to try to remove those as soon as you can before they go to seed. Okay, and now I want to get to how do you know your plants other than leave those stems and everything. Here are a few that are quite interesting because they are really, really not that leafy when they come out. They're more like a kind of an asparagus-like thing. It's going to stick out of the ground. One is Asclepias tuberosa, and you can see there's teeny tiny ones. This was just the other day. That's the far left in these images. Teeny tiny little nubs coming out at the bottom, and then these are farther along on the side. This plant, I swear, I thought was dead twice. It has never died. It's always come back. Even if it does die back, it comes back later. So, your milkweeds are generally pretty slow to emerge, and I would not give up on them if you think you've lost it, because very often I've seen some milkweeds even skip a year. They won't even come up. Like Sullivan's milkweed has skipped a year on me, and so has purple milkweed, where I thought it was dead and then just shows up again. So milkweeds are late and they're going to look a lot like this when they come up. Baptisias are just hilarious how much they look like asparagus when they come up. So the blue wild indigo is pretty well up right now. That's Baptisia australis. Um, White wild indigo is the one that's really late. The cream wild indigo, Baptisia bracteata, is just about ready to bloom. It is so early. But the white one, I can't even find it in the garden, but I guarantee you by June there will be something sticking out of the ground that looks just like that. So Amsonias, those the smaller ones are already setting blooms on the tips. And I have Amsonia illustris. I have three different species, four different species here, and they all kind of come up at a little bit different times, but they almost always come out. And then as soon as they start to kind of break open, like you see this one here doing, you'll see that they have a bundle of little blue flowers already, buds of flowers just about to bloom. They will be in full bloom by the 1st of May. So lots of excitement, but being able to know where these plants are for me depends on just having known where I put them and also leaving a little bit of a stem so I can find them. Um, and be prepared for enjoying all four seasons in these gardens. You can see the spring, this spring was a little bit later. Beautiful, lots of pastel colors. You can see my Amsonia blooming in there and everything. Summer is huge and rambunctious. Fall is warm and inviting. And then winter is that restful time when all of our beautiful butterflies, moths, every other insect that you love is hiding and sleeping very comfortably under all of the leaves and stems that you're leaving. And I believe I'm just sharing with you a few resources, which are the same ones that I shared last time, that are all very helpful with maintaining and beginning these gardens, and a little bit about from Xerces Society fact sheets about how to provide habitat for our pollinators. And other than that, I think that is all that I have prepared for you tonight. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, Patty, thank you very much. It looks like we do have one.
Okay.
Um, can I direct sow coneflower? If so, when is the best time? Do they need direct sunlight most of the day?
Yeah. So coneflower, would that be, and do you know the Latin name? I hope it's echinacea. Either way, if I were to start it, for propagation, I usually try to give it 90 days of cold. But like I said, not all seeds need to have that dormancy broken. I mean, even though all echinaceas typically want 90 days to break dormancy, not every seed in there needs it. So I can pretty reliably, as long as they're pretty fresh, throw seeds out and I'm going to get some germination anytime I do it. So I would say, yes, you can direct sow. I direct sowed everything that you saw in that seeded area in the front that has, and the one that's in all these seeded areas were just me throwing things out, and they're full of cone flowers. They're full of ratipidas. So yeah, you can. I just am not sure you're going to get a lot of germination this year. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, makes sense to me.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so do you have a preference on type of mulch you use?
A lot of people ask me that. I am, I use the cheapest mulch I can find that does not have any chemicals in it. So I'm looking for, usually, if I were to go pay big bucks, I'm gonna get double ground hardwood mulch. Um, I've also just used straw, which is not super effective, honestly. Um, it's great though for seeded areas to, put straw down. Um, so especially if it's bare dirt. Uh, but mulch that I'm looking for is not dyed any color. Double ground hardwood is, if I were to pay, you know, good money. Usually I'm looking for the cheapest mulch I can find though, and getting free mulch from a county or, something like that is just fine.
Okay, all right, awesome. Can you talk a bit about cutting back last year's stems? When to do it, how much to cut, etc.
Yeah. Um, okay. I'm going to preface it by saying, when I burn, I'm taking away all the stems. I mean, they're all burning and I'm killing every insect in there. I know that sounds sad. So I remember this when I think about how these plants developed and how um, these ecosystems developed, is that this disturbance, it's meant to be abundant. So this habitat is meant to be everywhere so that when some of it burns and some of it goes away, there's still some left. The problem that we have now is that these patches, it's so small, right? It's not abundant anymore. So I'm saying that only because you'll never, you're never going to take away all the stems everywhere. You're going to leave some, it's going to be messy. Um, and my tactic in that is that I don't do it everywhere. There is a resource in that list I gave you. It's about saving the stems or something like that. But it has a real simple illustration that shows you how the stem nesting bees are using stems. Um, the stems, and I've seen it happen. It's kind of counterintuitive because you think you're just saving it for this one year, but you're not. You're saving last year's, and then you have new ones that are this year's. So the last year, the bees are coming out of it, and this year you got to have it open. You got to already have an open one for the ones that have come out to go in. And they're going to do that at almost the same time. So it's really, really interesting. I have always read, and I just vary it a lot. Like some things I'm cutting way to the ground, some things I'm leaving really tall. But I've always heard 18 inches, but 12 to 24 inches, somewhere in there. I almost am never leaving things super tall, um, because it doesn't work in the garden. But I would say, 2 feet is about the highest that I ever leave these stems. But I would say the minimum would be, I think they'd need a minimum of about 10 inches. So
Okay.
that's what I'd say.
Um, this is just my thought here
Hmm.
before we get to
Hmm.
more questions, but I was just wondering, how did that work, just out in the prairie?
Right,
Okay, yes, fire
right,
came through and burned everything, patches. But
right.
I'm wondering, like, I guess it relied on like bison and stuff walking through and
Hmm.
breaking off the stems,
Yep. Or
maybe,
wind or
or
anything,
wind.
you
Okay,
know.
okay,
Yeah,
very
I would say I mean, but again, you got to think how abundant was the prairie. It was everywhere.
true.
There were
Yeah.
just miles and miles of just this habitat. So things could happen, um, and destroy a third of it or half of it or all of it, and there'd be next door to it where it wasn't destroyed. So, I think that that idea of leaving refugia is what I do throughout the gardens. So there will be spaces that are somewhat untouched. Like the burned areas here, I don't burn all the areas up front. I don't burn all the areas in the prairie. I always leave one space that I haven't done anything to. And it's not the prettiest space, but it is a place where I'm leaving refuge for animals to repopulate the spaces that are going to grow this year.
Okay. So, um, this comment says, I have a packet of Tatibida pinnata and Echinacea pallida from
Hmm.
K-State Extension.
Hmm.
I'm guessing that Christy wants to know, can she plant those right now or should she wait?
I think if I had those packets, I would plant them now. And maybe if you want to hedge your bets, I would do a little stratification. So Retibita pinnata is pretty easy. even though I usually give it 60 days of, so 2 months of cold. Um, and I would at least take part of those seeds though, just because this is the way I am. I'm just like most people. I'm gonna want that to go. So I'd try some fresh, without any, and then I would make myself a little, do some artificial stratification, put it in a wet kind of or damp paper towel and fold that up and put that in a plastic bag and put it in my refrigerator labeled and set myself an alarm and take it out in 2 months. You could try the 3 months for the echinacea. Um, but I would just give it a try without and maybe just reserve some that you stratify and then see what happens when you take that out. So you would still have time, say you did 3 months. Um, May, June, July. So in July, you're you're gonna want that echinacea to get going really fast, but to be able to plant it in the fall, plant that seedling in the fall to have kind of a second year plant the next year. But if you give it at least 60 days, I think even that would get it to germinate if your fresh seeds don't germinate. Does that make sense? I'm big on testing things like that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions that relate to the city's free mulch and the county's free mulch.
Okay.
So, do you have any worry about them having things like honeysuckle or other
Yeah.
things that might invade your spaces? Is it safe to use?
Well, I don't know. I can't guarantee that it's safe to use. No. I use the cheapest mulch I use is the this is I use erosion control mulch from uh Missouri Organic, but I have gotten free mulch from my county, which is Leavenworth County, and I have not had any trouble with it at all. Um, so Missouri Organics mulch, that erosion control mulch is it's big chunks of wood in it and stuff, but I have a method, and I only do that because it's inexpensive for me to get a whole bunch of it. But the county mulch, like I said, when I've used ours, I've never had any problem with it at all.
Hmm.
I did have some Johnson grass come up in, so this is just so when mulch is being turned in an area, they're usually these big areas. There could be Johnson grass growing in there. That Johnson grass gets picked up and you know fluffed up with the mulch when it's moved. And that's how Johnson grass came in with the last load of mulch that I got. So there you're gonna anytime you get something from somewhere else, and that's why I don't just buy topsoil from other people because I have no idea what is growing in that topsoil. The only other time I've gotten Johnson grass here was rhizomes came in some topsoil that we filled some raised beds with.
Mm.
So I mean, learning to identify invasive species is really important, but I would say birds are going to bring you invasive species, and I love birds. So it's we live in a world filled with invasive species. I'm more worried probably about chemicals um, that people tend to use in landscaping, but I don't think that I don't know how long, like preen, I don't know how long that lasts. Um, but I just avoid buying things that have that, but I don't think you're going to find a lot of problems with the mulch that comes in. That's just my perspective. It's not tested other than by me and my experience here.
Well, we have Nancy Chapman on the call, and she says she uses the Olathe mulch and compost, and she has not had any problems.
Oh, good. See,
And I mean, I will say too that any mulch that you buy, unless it's jam-packed with chemicals,
Hmm.
has the same chance of having something, you don't know where it's being manufactured and, mixed
Exactly.
and packaged. So who
Yeah.
knows what it's got in there.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, I just think it's great that we ask those questions. We start to, think about that because we all contribute, to what is going, we're all in the same community. We're
Mhm.
all, sharing these plants and the seeds that are being spread. So, I think it's awesome that people are thinking about those things.
Yes. So, is there a free app that could help ID the little green plants coming out of the ground?
There are free apps. I don't know how awesome they are at identifying things coming out of the ground. Um, I personally, I, I, I think that apps can help. So use an app if you'd like, and but only trust it. Don't trust it with the last truth that I would
Right.
say it's fallible, right? It's only as good as the picture you give it, and it might not have very much context. So I would say try it if you, but put your own thinking cap on too, and see if you can't do a little research into what answer it gives you. So it might help you though if you know the plant that's there. I don't know. I've never tested like iNaturalist or one of those to see if it knows the tip of a milkweed coming out of the ground. That would be interesting. I'm going to test that.
No, I feel like they really struggle with the grasses for sure.
Yes.
If you have any
Oh yeah.
grasses, even you could even have a grass that is almost seeding out and it still is like
Yeah. Yeah.
eh.
Yeah, I think it's more fun to figure it out yourself, but
And that's why you're teaching this class.
I just had so much fun with that. But grasses are hard. Oh my gosh, I would challenge you to identify anything except, well, no, I've got three that I can identify as little tiny babies if they, have developed that character yet. But grasses are hard when they're babies.
Yes. And Julie did bring up a good point that the Gardener's Guide to Prairie Plants does have a good seedling. It has good seedling photos to go off of. It's a good guide for that.
It
So you
does.
can
That is
look
an
into the
awesome
book.
book.
Um, One other question we've got on here, how long do you let your new cardboard slash mulched areas sit before you plant? 1 year?
It depends. Like I said, that one that was a epic fail. All the bindweed just came right through all the cardboard because I didn't water it. So here that's been sitting all winter and it didn't work. So I like to use my hand and I just dig down in there and if that cardboard is flat and I can put my hand through it, take my finger and just rip it apart, then it's ready. It's ready as it can be. Um, I've even planted like really, really soon after that. I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you had a lot of grass, but that you didn't get it cleaned off. But in a fairly clean space, it doesn't take very long, just a few weeks. Um, but the longer you wait, the better, is what I would say. So 3 weeks, 4 weeks would be, I like 6 weeks the best, but there you
Hmm.
go.
Okay. Um, so I know in my area, I didn't do a good job of getting the grass killed. So,
Uh-huh.
but I also planted plugs in there. So I can't just go in and spray the grass. I don't quite know what to do.
Ah. Hmm. So
So
this is a prepped area that you
this is
and
a
then
prepped area that failed.
okay.
And so it's
Um,
got my yard's grass, which is probably a type of brome.
yeah. You know
And
what? You know what I would do if I couldn't spray? It depends on how close you're planted, right?
Hmm.
I would try and I'd cut that off and I'd try to smother it again,
Okay.
right? I
Yeah.
would go around and try smothering again, just like I do, boy, if I have a bad weed infestation or like something just got out of hand and this is a mulched area, I will use that cardboard and mulch, just patch work in to try to clean things up. And
Well,
it does work.
I mean, I would do that, but I got the bright idea in January to spread a ton of seeds too in there. So I don't want, now
I
I'm
don't
just
know
gonna
what to
have
tell
to,
you.
yeah. Well,
Well,
if I mow and I keep
yes,
that grass down, yeah,
that is a good idea. So then you're starting to treat it a little bit more like like as if it's a seated space, right?
yes, yes.
Yeah, so yeah. I because that front yard that I showed you that has the gray-headed coneflowers that with my house behind it, um,
Hmm.
that was seeded right into an old lawn, that we just burned it and seeded into it. So I never removed that grass. It just was me knocking the grass back with a burn and then seeding into it.
Right. And then the hope is that the most of the plants that you're putting in there are going to outcompete the cool season grass,
Yeah.
but
And
we'll
it
see.
does work. It takes a while.
Yes. And my neighbor did offer me a bunch of marigold seeds because he thought that area looked really bad. And I said, no, thank you. So, is there any other questions for Patty before we close shop here? Going once. I think that yeah, it's a very exciting time in the garden right now, just seeing what's coming up. But you also, I think, get a little antsy, like, come on, come on, come on. I gotta do something.
I'm the opposite. I'm like, no, wait. I
Oh,
haven't done what I'm supposed to yet.
oh,
Wait.
well, yeah. Well, okay. It doesn't look like there's any other questions. So with that, thank you all for coming. I'll work on getting the recording uploaded and everything and sent out to everybody. And again, tune in July to the summer edition, and hopefully we'll see you all then. Thank you
Thank you,
very much,
everybody.
Patty.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.